Good afternoon, everyone. If you want to come and take your seats, I think we're going to get started. Nick was just saying it's a bit of a shame that the bar is closed. Lovely. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone in the room, and also we're live streaming, so welcome to those who are online as well. So in this afternoon's session, we're going to be looking at this idea of neuroarchitecture. So that is designing for neurodiversity and accessibility and inclusion. My name's Emma Meyer. I'm going to be chairing this discussion and conversation this afternoon. I am a behavioural scientist, so that means I spend my time looking at human behaviour and well-being, what influences that, what we might be able to do to change and improve it. So that involves looking inside people at their psychology, their past experiences, those sorts of things, and their brain-body connection, but also means looking at the environment, and a lot of it involves looking at the environment and that space and connection and the influence that it has, both social environment and also physical environment. So I'm really excited to have the opportunity to have this conversation and to hear from Nick, our speaker for today. So I'm very pleased to introduce Nick, Professor Nick Tyler from UCL. He's director for the Centre of Transport Studies, and he's also the founder and director of PEARL. Now, PEARL is the People, Environment, Activity Research Laboratory. And for those of you who haven't come across it, I suspect many of you will have, but for those of you who haven't, it's a really groundbreaking facility which enables the building of life-sized environments so that we can study interaction between environments and people, both at the sort of spatial and temporal dimensions. So really exciting space, and Nick has done all sorts of amazing experiments covering a huge amount of different ground, from sort of streetscapes to supermarkets to transport hubs to all sorts of other things. And if we're lucky, he'll touch on a few of those when he's talking with us this afternoon. But I think, above all, Nick is quite a rare example of a truly transdisciplinary research leader. And lots of people talk about multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary. There's not very many people doing it, and there's fewer still who are genuinely crossing those boundaries. And I think one of the exciting things about the work that Nick does is the knowledge and the experience that he brings from a whole range of areas, from music to engineering to neurobiology. So, Nick, over to you.
Well, thank you. Gosh, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for coming. This is going to be a bit of a romp through your brain. So hold tight, because I'm going to have to go quite quickly.
It won't hurt, will it?
The first kind of question is that I have to ask is how actually we perceive the world around us, because in the end, everything we do depends on that perception. And the one thing, when we talk to neuroscientists, it's really fun. You know, they show, look at this brain. There's this bit lights up when you see something, or there's this bit that lights up when you think something, and all this sort of stuff. It's very good, but they cannot find the place in the brain where you perceive anything. But actually, it's the perception that is going to drive how you're going to respond to it. So we started to think, how would we find out how we perceive? And that's kind of why we built PEARL. But let's sort of have a little bit of a look at that. The first thing is that we're in a world, and that world is sending us stuff. It's sending us signals. Today it's sending us temperature signals, or wet signals, or noise, or whatever it is. And we have a sensory system that picks all these things up. At the moment, we're working with about 70 senses. So you can think of your 5 and then think of a lot more. All of your 5 major senses are immediately mediated by the fact that you've got stomachache or something, right? And that's because you have internal senses as well as external senses. And what you actually start to the perception process is actually to mix all that stuff together. And so the world is emitting stuff, and we actually detect that. So we get all this information coming in through those sensorial pathways, and we sort of blend it all together. A couple of weeks ago, we were doing some experiments where somebody wanted to create serenity. I won't tell you why, but anyway, they wanted to create serenity, and they thought this would be good if you did it with light, sound, and smell. So we mixed up light, sound, and smell, and they were really keen to know how much light, how much smell, how much sound would add up to serenity. So we put all these people through various combinations of light, sound, and smell, and we measured what they did. We looked at their brains, we looked at their skin, we asked them to say immediately afterwards, how serene did you feel and how intense was this experience, all this sort of stuff. And then afterwards, we had to ask them about the smell and the sound, and none of them, not one participant, could tell us about the sound, the smell, or the light. They could all tell us which combination felt more serene, but none of them could identify what made it feel serene. So I have a very interesting job of trying to explain this to a rather belligerent client, I suppose we would call them, who really wants to know how much smell they have to put into their environment. So that mixture is actually really key to what we're doing. And so what we need to start to sort of think about is how we actually respond to that is by releasing hormones, by doing all sorts of stuff. So if you have to run away, for example, we release stress hormones and adrenaline and cortisol and things like that to sort of kit us out for being able to run away very fast. And we know if you get on a crowded tube train, your cortisol level will shoot up. And as you won't be running away in the crowded tube train, it takes a few hours to go back down again, just in time for you to get on the train to go back home again. And so you're dosing yourselves with this almost pure glucose twice a day for your working life. I wonder what that really does in the long term. So we have this idea that you've got this stuff coming in, and we have to create this perception. And there's a kind of process. So you start off, and how it works is you start off with an idea. It's what we call prior perception or your lived experience. Everything starts from that. And then that gets updated with all this sensorial information. You create a new one, a new experience, and you say, this new experience is going to make me die. So therefore, I need to do something to stop doing that. So I need to run away, or I need to do something, or I need to shiver, or I need to close my eyes, or whatever that is. We create those responses, and that then gives us a new perception of the new world as we are. What the brain is trying to do is make all of that combination match the world that it perceives. And so it's always trying to predict what's going to happen in the future and then try and adjust you to be able to respond to that. And that then leads into a reaction of what you actually do. And you can sort of kind of think of that as being, well, I sort of believe I know how the world is. I learn something new about it, so I prepare for that change. I feel something, and then I act, and I go and do something. So we have this kind of process going on all the time that we do. And that turns into this idea of perception. And the thing that's interesting here is you have two kinds of perception. One is the preconscious perception. That's the perception you don't know that you have. And the other is the conscious perception, which is the one that you do know you have. And the thing, just to put that in perspective, is that your brain has the capacity for processing information of around about 11 million bits per second. That's actually quite slow. I mean, your telephone is probably processing information like 64 gigabits per second, but it's very boring information and it's doing the same thing all the time. Your brain's much smarter. 11 million bits per second. Of that 11 million bits per second, 80 are what you're consciously aware of. So what you actually know is nothing like as much as what your brain knows and how it is adjusting for what's going on. And therefore, when we are designing things, and we design it for what you're consciously aware of, we're actually missing a massive trick. Because actually what we have to do is design it for the bit you don't know you're aware of. That's what's actually going to make it work well for you. So when we look at that, we started to look at the multisensory bit, all this data coming in from the environment. And so if we have a look at that a little bit, we can start to see how that begins to work. We have this preconception, we then bring in all this other stuff, and that starts to enable us to predict this difference between what we think the world is, what the brain believes the world to be, and what the world is actually like. And therefore, and it then turns that into something. So this all sounds really airy-fairy. So if you get on a train, you hear the train, and the train goes along, and you hear the brakes being applied, and you find yourself, you're sitting there facing the direction of travel, as they used to call it. And as the brakes are applied, you kind of lean forward, and you think, oh, this is because the train is slowing down, and all these clever inertial forces and things are pushing me forward. But actually, when we did this, we found all the passengers dutifully leaning forward as the train was slowing down, and you could hear all the brakes being applied and all that sort of stuff, and they all leaned forward, except that the train was not moving. And just a slight technical problem there, and the reason is that what actually is happening is that the brain is predicting. It takes the sensory stimuli from the hearing that says that the brakes are being applied, and it says, you are going to be subjected to all these inertial forces, therefore, to protect you, I'm going to make you lean forward, because that's the best protection that we learned about last time. And so that's what we're going to do. And of course, when our train isn't moving, but we give you all those stimuli, you react. And that's one of the few evidential pieces of evidence, actually, that shows that that is how the brain works. And so we can then use that in our laboratory. Now, what's all that got to do with neurodiversity? And that's an interesting question. So there's an awful lot of stuff talked about neurodiversity at the moment. But I think most people would now agree that when we say neurodiversity, we are actually talking about the whole range of brains in the population. Now, when your brain is working on the basis of lived experience, everybody in this room has a different lived experience. In fact, everybody on the planet has a different lived experience. There are 8 billion brains on the planet. Everyone is different, and they all have ranges of capability from one extreme to another, however you really wish to measure it. That is neurodiversity. And we then look at neurodiversity, and we say, how is actually all this going on? And we go through a kind of process of thinking, how do we actually work out? And we are living in this eco world. We have our own capabilities and our lived experience and the things we can do and things we can't. We can bring all that in there. We can start to think about all of this. And a lot of these things are determined by the environment we're in. And then we come to this rather crunchy bit where we say, well, in order for me to face the world, my brain has to make an adaptation. And the capability of making that adaptation is going to affect how well I can cope with the world. And then on the other side, we have a world which we can adapt, and that should be, so what we're trying to do is make the world fit people rather better than it does. And so we have this kind of joining together of the brain adapting to the world and the world adapting to the brain that is how we're meeting the interface with people whose brain activity may or may not match that world. And that's where we begin to see the idea of neurodivergence. And often people think about, when they start talking about neurodivergence, the first question I asked when I heard that term is, divergent from what? And the answer is, normally, they would say, oh, from the normal. But that's nonsense. Actually, what we really mean is divergent from what we design the world for. In other words, we design a chair to work this way, we design an environment to work in this way. If it doesn't work for you, you're neurodivergent. And then we start to think you're a problem, and then we diagnose you with something, and so it goes on. And we end up in this vicious circle where people are being kind of fairly maltreated by the rest of society because we haven't built a world that they can actually tolerate. And that creates massive problems. So, how can we make that environment work for everyone? That, to me, is the challenge. And how can we actually find out what we're actually having to do that for? So, we can take this into our laboratory. So I made this laboratory so we could create worlds, and then we can see how people could cope with them. And that's it. And we have a vision. We're the only laboratory in the university that has a vision. It's very interesting, you know, because we want to make a better world. The others want to make money. I know I'll never do that. So but the idea is that that is exactly what we're about, is what is that better world for everybody, not just for the people who like it. So what we do is we kind of build these environments, and this is a bit of inside that laboratory. This is a case when we were looking at how do people with visual impairment and actually also people at the wider ranges of neurodiversity cope with a bus stop where cyclists can go through the bus stop. So we built a bus stop, and we brought in the bus, and we brought in all the people, and then we measure actually what is all that process going on in their brain, in their skin, in their feet, in their heart, and so on, that's going on. And the answer is they are terrified. So visually impaired people, their stress levels shoot up. They are basically scared by simply being on the environment because they can only detect that bicycle after it's gone past them. And until then, all they know is it might. So you're living in a world of being kind of targeted but not quite, or feeling that you are targeted but not actually being able to absorb. So that's one kind of thing. The neurodiverse people, the people on the edges of neurodiversity, they found it because they found it a bit like a prison. Because if they don't want to be in a crowded environment and they want to spread out a bit, they get stuck because they're now on an island with a bus with cyclists going on one side and traffic on the other, and they just feel incredibly cramped and they can't work out how to deal with that. So we've kind of built a piece of infrastructure that terrifies people, makes them feel trapped. Doesn't sound too good to me. Another one is zebra crossings. You have to light zebra crossings 3.5 times as brightly as the road either side. Absolutely wonderful, except that it only lights the pedestrian's head. So the pedestrian feels very, very bright and safe, like the top left picture. And I'm bathed in light. Everybody can see me. The driver can see nothing at all. And I won't go into all the things that happen in your vision as the pedestrian walks across the black and white background because your eyes switch off. So actually that pedestrian is almost pretty certainly invisible to the driver. And so we looked at how do cars approaching a zebra crossing, how does that work? How does the person do that? So we brought a car into the lab, we drove it up and down, and we put the lighting for days and nights and all sorts of things, and we discovered that people actually have really quite a very hard job at working out when they can and can't cross the road. Looking at e-scooters, very popular things, we made a sound. We made a sound for e-scooters for Transport for London so that it works with our vestigial hearing system in order to work out how we can actually use our own alert system to drive the possibility of warning us that there's going to be something coming that we can't see. And that, again, very, very interesting one. And we worked a lot with vast ranges of people in various forms of what we might loosely call disability, including people with hearing difficulties, people with sight loss, people, neurodiverse people, all sorts of people. So we could understand what would happen if we do this, so that we could actually make their lives slightly better. The crowding on the train, interesting one. I mentioned that about people shooting up their cortisol levels simply by getting on a train. But we did some work with autistic children in a park, urban parks, very difficult for autistic children because the greening effect, the calming effect of being in green is offset by the park being in an urban area. So you now have a noise level which is around traffic, helicopters, sirens, all of these things, all of them unexplained. It's like living in a green hand dryer. Sudden noises that you can't quite cope with. So we built a park in the laboratory, and we had them play in the park, and they came in and they played. They thought it was really cool to have a park in a building, and they came and played. And what the psychiatrists were doing was trying to work out how they would know how these children were responding, because they had no idea. And they were then taking that away to see how they can understand that kind of interaction with the environment, so that we can start to understand a bit better how can we start to do things with the environment to do that. The picture on the right is a supermarket we built. That was for Oxford University. who had done a lot of work on autistic people's perceptions of the environment. And one of the top things that was problematic was supermarkets. Very, very harsh, bright lighting, very loud noise, narrow aisles, shelves stacked with all the same things and all that. So what you see there is a kind of image of how these autistic people reported seeing a supermarket. So we built it like that. And then we worked out with the autistic people how you might change that to make it more acceptable, and brought in the supermarket operators to come and have a look at it. They were deeply shocked that their supermarkets were so offensive to some people. Whether they're going to do anything about it is really difficult. But there's sort of simple things. Virtually every supermarket pumps into the supermarket the smell of bread baking, because that will draw you into the supermarket. It's always put at the back, so you're drawn into the supermarket to buy everything else. But if you smell bread and you see chocolate, it's a confusion. And that's the kind of thing that they were finding very difficult. So we were able to sort of start to show the supermarket operators just that kind of thing. There is actually one glimmer in here. The British Standards Institute has a standards document called Design for the Mind. And this actually is quite good. So if you want to have a look at the kinds of things to think about, that is actually not a bad place to start. And it is out there and it's free. But actually, the best way of finding out about this stuff isn't to go to the standards, it's to go and ask the people who have the issue. And so what we really need to do is to have a conversation with people across the whole of the neurodiverse spectrum. And that means sometimes some quite difficult conversations. So we have to do that. And so what we need to do is to work with the whole community to figure out how the compromises that are going to arise are going to be worked out. Some people are super sensitive to loud noise. Some people are super sensitive to no noise. Now, somewhere in there is something that's going to work maybe for both, or maybe we can't actually find something that works for both, and we have to work out how we work for each. But that is only something you're going to find out when we talk to people. And so one of the things that we've been working on is building this idea of co-cultivation. We have co-everything these days, so I thought, why not have another one? So co-cultivation. And it's kind of like the farmer. The farmer doesn't start by planting the seed. The farmer prepares the ground first. And that preparing the ground will tell them what kinds of seed they can plant, and how they plant it and when and all that sort of stuff. And then you have to nurture the plant. You have to, while it's in its very delicate state, you have to sort of figure out how it's going to work. And then you get to harvest the product. And then you've got your answer. But then you don't go to sleep. You actually have to go prepare the ground for the following year. So this idea of co-cultivation is this continuing process of talking with the community and learning from what you have and learning how you're going to improve it. It's a never-ending but always improving process. And that we find is one of the best ways of having that continuing kind of conversation, of actually determining the kinds of things that we can actually do to enable people whose brain activity is such that we are designing them out of the system without thinking about it. And that's, I think, the best way to do it. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick. I'm gutted that I didn't get to come and see the supermarket as experienced by autistic people. I find supermarkets horrifying enough as it is, but fantastic. I wondered if we might pick up on that point that you were making last there. You were talking about co-cultivation. How would you say that differs from, we've heard a lot about co-design and other sort of similar concepts, so give us some thoughts on what the difference, what's unique about it?
Okay, well, this is how you can upset everybody. I think to me that there's a real risk in the world of design that I come along and design something and I think it's great. And somebody else comes along and looks at it and says, that is terrible. But I say, no, but I designed it. It's great. You should know it's great. And there's a little bit of a risk in that. And so we now have, so you then think, well, maybe I should talk to the people who are going to look at this thing. So we have co-design, and we get people involved in that process of design. So I think that's kind of part. But to me, the reason I wanted to look for a different kind of term was it doesn't feel deep enough. And I think the difference with co-cultivation is you're kind of in the soil. You're kind of in the ground. This is not just about me designing something with somebody else. This is about that somebody else being very much a major part of the process. And in the sense of the ground supplies the nutrients and the minerals and all the rest of it. I mean, a vigneron told me once that the sign of a really healthy environment is a perfect vine, because the roots of the vine go down into the soil, gather up all the minerals, the leaves all talk to the sun and the rain, and when you have the balance right, you have your perfect grape, and therefore you have your perfect wine. So he saw the vine, he's probably a bit biased, but he saw the vine as this kind of measure of doing those things. And to me, co-cultivation is a bit like that. We need all of that, the minerals and the nutrients in the soil as well as the sun and the rain, in order to be able to create the good vine. And so co-cultivating and that essence of understanding the land that vigneron has is actually about how we actually work with the people that we're designing. So a person designing isn't actually something unique. They're part of the process, and the person, if you like, being designed with is also part of the process, and that's kind of brought in together. So that's kind of why I think it's different.
And so what does that mean for the role of people involved in placemaking? Does it change their role in the process? Is it just a reframing? Does it change the approach that they have to take? Maybe we should ask them in a minute.
I don't want to pronounce really, but has anyone here been to a place called Medellin in Colombia? Fairly safe. Yeah. Well, in Medellin is a very, very interesting city, has a wonderful, a really horrible city. It was the murder capital of the world, had 15,000 homicides a year. And then it transformed. So I'm not going to go through the whole story. But in Medellin, they were very conscious that they had to get people to trust each other in order to have society in the city working. When you're not shooting and killing each other, you need to trust each other. And lots and lots of things happened as a result of that. But the one I wanted to tell you about was the planners. So the urban planners. So the urban planners work on the street in the city 4 days a week. And 1 day a week they go to the office. And when they're on the street, they wear big red coats which say planner. And the idea is that they enter into a kind of daily conversation with people on the street, so that they can be better planners. Okay, so I thought this was a sort of kind of interesting. So I said, could I go out with one of these planners while they were going around on the street? So off I went. I didn't have a red coat. I was spared the red coat, but I was with somebody who did. And it was really interesting. The conversations that they had were about last night's football and the price of bread in the supermarket or whatever. It's a kind of very, very ordinary conversation. And then suddenly somebody would say, do you know what, that car park over there, it's not right. It's a terrible place. It's too scary. Women don't like going in there. Maybe you need a tree. Maybe we should think about that. And then I realized that what this exercise was that the planners had actually suddenly become people. And they were having the kinds of conversations that people have about last night's football, about the park, or whatever it was. And as a result of that, you find they are able to make the kinds of planning decisions that are actually co-cultivated, because their co-cultivation is these conversations. And the people could then raise questions. They could raise problems with them without it being the some huge bureaucratic process that they have to get into, and often most people are put off from doing it and all the rest of it. So this was actually about bringing people and planners together as unifying force. So I think the answer to your question, what does it actually mean? It means that we have to kind of take off our planner hat and put on our people hat, and realize that actually the expertise of that person in the street is as good as the expertise I might have as a planner. It's just simply a different perspective. It's a different part of that vine, ground, sun, rain combo. And what we need to do is to get that exercise, to get that pure vine. And I think that's what I would say. So go out on the street 4 days a week, wear your red coat.
There you go, that's your challenge. On that note, I wonder whether anybody has got anything that they would like to ask. Imagine that Nick has his red coat on now. He is wandering amongst you. Ah, there's a hand there.
Hello. Hi, Nick. It's Malcolm Hamilton here, Play Disrupt. So I guess we do quite a lot of engagement and work with neurodivergent people and people with additional needs, etc., in our kind of work. And something I've been thinking about a lot recently is like more about our bodies, and particularly when we're having conversations about parks, for instance, that loads of engagement and lots of conversations that we have are in our heads. So we're thinking in our heads about the way that we act in a park. And then we look at pictures of parks in a different building to have a conversation about the park. And then we talk. It's all head, 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 head. And it's not really very much about our bodies. And it's not very, and we seem quite scared as people sometimes to be able to, or maybe we're just not well equipped within certain industries, to be able to have conversations about how we feel in a place and about the impact of that place on our nervous systems and about how that impact. And I guess as a parent of neurodivergent children as well, like how important our nervous system is within that and how we react and all that sort of stuff you talked about. I guess I was just sort of wondering, when you're talking about the testing and everything and you're talking about how people react in Pearl, how that sort of, what you're doing around bodies, or whether that fits within bodies and whether that becomes part of that as well, because I guess I'm just really interested in moving more into our bodies in the conversations that we're having about place.
Okay, so really, really interesting question. I think one of the things we do in Pearl, of course, we actually bring the bodies in, and that means that we can, and that's why it's worth making the park or making the bus stop, is because you're actually bringing the body into the circumstance, and then we can start to see what actually happens as a result of that. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, in the end, you've got 86 billion neurons in your brain, and they are firing all the time, and they're doing all this stuff. Your brain consumes 20% of your energy. It's a hard work being a brain, and we do need to understand. A lot of that then gets expressed in how people change in their body. So I'll give you a really simple example, and this is actually with older people. Rather than neurodivergent people. But older people, when they are walking along and they see something like a step, typically they'll see it about 3 or 4 meters in front of them. One of the first things that happens is their foot, they place slightly more pressure in the middle of their foot than they do the rest of the time. And it's very characteristic that older people do that. Younger people don't do it. And why? We think it's because it's kind of saying, I'm not quite sure how I'm going to handle this obstacle. And it's a kind of way of just sort of pushing themselves a bit further into the ground to stabilize themselves or something like that. We haven't really managed to figure out what's going on because they are completely unaware that they're doing it. So it's a very, very interesting one. And I think you're right. Bringing the people, this is the difference between doing this with a physical kind of place like Pearl and, for example, giving them a VR headset. Because the VR headset really, even the more sophisticated ones, really relies very, very heavily on vision. And it kind of ignores the rest of you. They do some with hearing and some will have a little bit of smell, but they don't actually do anything else. Whereas when you come into Pearl, it is a completely immersive experience. And so we can actually start to do that. And because it's in the controlled circumstance, we can start to look at that. We can see how people's postures change or their mood. So we can see the physical ramification of it, but we can also see the physiological one as well. So I think you're right. I think that is absolutely right. And we can think through how that helps us to understand what might be happening when we're not in a laboratory, when you're looking at people in a park. What are we actually seeing there may be indicative of what's going on in their brains. But certainly I think having that ability to be able to study that in detail is a really important step forward, really.
Thank you. Any other questions out there? I can see one at the back here and one there. Lovely.
It's Leah Stewart from Civic. Hello. I wanted to come back to your bus stop experiment, because you've clearly tested some existing bus stop types. It all looks amazing. Did you find the perfect design that worked? I speak as someone who designs these kind of things. I don't want to bake in more tyranny into the public realm.
I think bus stops are really great. You know, I think, you know, it's amazing. London has 20,000 bus stops. What a fantastic opportunity for a public realm. And what do we do with it? We just sort of throw it away. And I think, you know, actually, yeah, we can make some really, really socially responsible bus stops that actually work for people, that work well for the whole community. There is really no reason why a bus has to put out a ramp for a wheelchair user to get on the bus. We can design a bus stop that doesn't need that, but we tend not to. We can make a bus stop that is much better for people with different senses of whether they want to be crowded or not. We can do all sorts of things with bus stops, and it's a phenomenal opportunity to make the public realm, the ordinary sort of standard public realm that nobody pays any attention to. So we can make it real and we can make it good for people. And I think that is all totally possible. We need to make conscious decisions about the use of space. So 25 years ago, God, we did some work for what was then London Transport, prehistory, on how you got the bus driver to be able to come close to the curb. And what became very apparent was that takes a certain amount of distance. You had to sort of sterilize 44 meters or something of curb. There is no way that any local authority in the country would sterilize 44 meters of curb for a bus stop. That was to assure that the bus could get into they just wouldn't do it. I think that situation is a little bit different now. And I think we need to understand a lot more about how we make the public realm good for everybody, and that means that we need to understand that there are things that need to be done. And so I would say the first thing you need to do is design the bus stop to get the bus somewhere near it, as opposed to half a meter out into the road. I think we can do a lot more about telling people on the bus where the bus stop is and telling people at the bus stop where the bus is. We did some work just before COVID on signaling for dementia, people with dementia, by adding a tune, a very exciting tune, a 5-note tune. So every bus stop in London had a 5-note tune. And we knew that you didn't have to learn all 20,000 tunes, because most people only use about half a dozen bus stops. So they would know their tunes. And one of the interesting things is people with dementia's ability to recall music lasts much, much longer than their ability to respond to words. And so we were able to get people with dementia to recognize when they were coming to their bus stop. And you can use the same principle for telling the people at the bus stop which bus is coming. And both of those things are very good for people with dementia, but they're also good for people with visual impairments. They're good for people who don't have any of these sort of things but just need to know where their bus stop is. You know, so there's lots of things that we can do, but it does need to realize that bus stops take space. That's the first thing. We're actually just starting some investigation with 3D printing bus stops. I found a 3D printer that is huge. So We have a giant 3D printer that can 3D print a bus stop. And the great thing is it's recyclable. So when you don't like your bus stop anymore, you chuck it all back in the 3D printer and you can make another one. And it's absolutely fantastic. So we're just setting off at the moment to, we're applying for some European money to see if we can do a trial. So if anybody wants some recyclable magic bus stops, we'd be up for that.
Who doesn't want a recyclable magic bus stop? I'm there. We finished the end of our time, I'm afraid. I would just like to ask you for just a closing sort of reflection. We spoke earlier about, somebody said tyranny earlier, the sort of tyranny of normality, I suppose, and this idea of 8 billion people, 8 billion brains. If we've got to a point where we recognise that, what might a future city look like? Or what might a future placemaker look like? Just an easy one to end on.
I think the future city is essentially tiny. So you can have a city of 30 million people, 10 million people, however, but actually people relate to relatively small groups. In maybe in the 5s and 10s kind of number rather than the 100s and 200s and 300s number. And I think when we take the 8 billion brains and we kind of think about that individuality and celebrating that individuality and bringing it together as a social connection, what we're talking about is how you make that connection between the 4 or 5, 10 people. And your city of 10 million is simply how those then connect to each other. So to me, the future city is about connecting social spaces where the sociality, the ability to greet, the ability to have a conversation of no meaning is what drives how we do it. Do we create spaces in which you can just have a chat or do nothing and people can still warm to that and make that into the city? So for me, the future city is kind of built out of sociality spaces.
Thank you very much.